What do you do when the sea is in front of you and your enemy is behind you? For Israel, God didn't remove the sea, He split it. And the very waters that once threatened to drown them became walls of protection on their right and on their left. Sometimes your greatest obstacle is about to become your greatest testimony. Exodus chapter 14 verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and, behold, the Egyptians marched after them. And they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. Pharaoh drew nigh. Pharaoh had changed his mind after letting Israel go. Exodus chapter 14 verses 5 to 9. His army, chariots, and horsemen advanced rapidly toward the Israelites. Lifted up their eyes, an expression that means they became aware of the approaching danger. It emphasizes sudden realization and fear. The Egyptians marched after them, a symbol of oppression chasing God's people. Their past bondage seemed to be catching up with them. They were sore afraid. The Hebrew word, yar, miad, means terrified exceedingly. This was deep, overwhelming fear. Cried out unto the Lord. Despite their fear, Israel instinctively turned to God. This cry may have been mixed with desperation and complaint, but it was still directed toward God, showing dependence in crisis. Like Israel, we often find ourselves between an enemy and the sea, stuck between past struggles pursuing us and an uncertain future in front of us. Fear is a natural response, but God desires us to turn that fear into faith. Instead of letting fear paralyze us, we should let it push us into prayer. The passage teaches that even when danger is real and overwhelming, crying out to God is the right response. Our natural instinct may be to panic, but our spiritual instinct must be to pray. Sometimes, God allows us to face impossible situations so we can learn that deliverance doesn't come from human strength but from His mighty power. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 10 reminds us that when fear rises, faith must rise higher. The Israelites saw their enemy and trembled, but their cry reached God. When surrounded by fear, the right response is to lift our eyes to God, not just to the enemy. What looks like a dead end is often the stage for God's greatest deliverance. Exodus chapter 14 verse 11. And they said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? They said unto Moses, in fear, the people turned their frustration toward their leader. Panic often seeks someone to blame. Because there were no graves in Egypt, a sarcastic, bitter statement. Egypt was famous for tombs and burial grounds, so their words mock Moses' leadership, as if he led them out only to die without proper graves. Die in the wilderness. They exaggerated their danger, assuming certain death instead of trusting in God's plan. Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us? The people questioned Moses' motives and, indirectly, God's. In their fear, they forgot God's promises of deliverance. To carry us forth out of Egypt, ironically, they longed for slavery rather than face uncertainty. This shows how fear can distort perspective. Fear can quickly turn into complaint, blame, and doubt. Instead of remembering God's mighty acts, the plagues, the Passover, freedom, the Israelites looked at their present danger and forgot God's past faithfulness. We must guard against letting fear rewrite history. The same God who delivered us yesterday is faithful today. This verse challenges us to recognize how easily we can direct frustration toward others, leaders, pastors, even loved ones, instead of placing our trust in God. Faith requires us to look forward with trust, not backward with regret. Final takeaway. When fear is not surrendered to faith, it often turns into complaint and blame. The Israelites mocked Moses because they forgot God's promises. But God had not brought them out to bury them, He brought them out to bless them. We must trust that God doesn't deliver us halfway, He will finish what He started. Exodus chapter 14 verse 12. Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians, than that we should die in the wilderness. Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt? The people remind Moses of their earlier reluctance. Exodus chapter 5 verse 21. They claim they never wanted to leave, showing their short memory of oppression. Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. They preferred slavery to risk. Fear distorted their judgment, making bondage look safer than freedom. It had been better to serve. The Hebrew structure emphasizes comparison. They believed submission to Egypt's cruelty was better than trusting God in uncertainty. Die in the wilderness. Their assumption of death reveals unbelief. Instead of expecting God to save them, they prepared for defeat. This verse reflects a common human struggle. When faced with challenges, we sometimes long for the familiar bondage of the past rather than the uncertain freedom of faith. Fear will always try to pull us backward. It whispers, "You were better off before you stepped out in faith." But faith looks forward to God's promise. We must learn not to romanticize the past when the present looks difficult. Egypt was not better, it was bondage. The wilderness was not the end, it was the path to promise. This teaches us that deliverance requires courage to walk forward, even when fear tempts us to retreat. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 12 shows that fear makes us prefer the chains we know over the freedom we don't yet see. But God does not deliver his people to destroy them, he delivers to fulfill his promises. Faith must choose forward, even when fear wants to run back. Exodus chapter 14 verse 13. And Moses said unto the people, Fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. Fear ye not, a divine command often repeated in Scripture. Isaiah chapter 41 verse 10, Luke chapter 2 verse 10. Fear is natural, but faith requires choosing trust over terror. Stand still, Hebrew. Yatsib, not meaning inactivity, but steadiness, calmness, and readiness to watch God work. Instead of panicking or running, they were to rest in faith. See the salvation of the Lord. Salvation, Hebrew, Yeshua, means deliverance, rescue, or victory. God himself would intervene, their part was to trust. He will show to you today, God's deliverance was not distant, but immediate. The danger was real, but so was his power. The Egyptians, ye shall see them again no more forever, a permanent deliverance. God was not just going to buy time, he was about to break the enemy's grip completely. When we face impossible situations, God often calls us first to stop fearing and stand firm. Our instinct is to run, fight, or panic, but God calls us to faith. This verse reminds us that some enemies in life are not just resisted, they are defeated permanently by God's hand. What chases you today may never chase you again once God intervenes. We must learn to shift from looking at the enemy to looking for God's salvation. Deliverance is not achieved by our strength, but by his hand. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 13 declares that God's people don't need to be consumed by fear. When you stand still in faith, you will see the salvation of the Lord. The enemies that look overwhelming today may be the very ones God removes forever. Exodus chapter 14 verse 14. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. This verse was spoken by Moses to the Israelites as they stood trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. Fear gripped them, they saw no escape, yet Moses reminded them that God himself would fight on their behalf. The Lord shall fight for you means that victory doesn't depend on human effort but on divine power. God was about to display his strength through the parting of the sea. Ye shall hold your peace means be still, stay calm, and trust God. Silence in this context wasn't weakness, it was faith in motion. Sometimes, standing still in trust is the loudest statement of belief you can make. God didn't need their swords or strategies, he needed their stillness and surrender. Their role was obedience, God's role was deliverance. We often face Red Sea moments, times when the way forward is blocked, and the past is chasing us. Panic tempts us to act in haste or speak in fear. But Exodus chapter 14 verse 14 teaches us that God fights best when we stop striving and start trusting. When you pray and release control, God moves in ways your effort never could. Your peace becomes a weapon of faith. So, in conflict, in crisis, or in confusion, remember, your silence in faith invites God's strength to speak loudly on your behalf. Let go of the fight that isn't yours. Stand still, stay faithful, and let God show himself strong. When you stop trying to fix it your way, God begins to fight it his way, and his way always leads to victory. Exodus chapter 14 verse 15. And the Lord said unto Moses, Wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel, that they go forward. Wherefore criest thou unto me? This doesn't mean prayer was wrong. Rather, God was saying, this is not the time to only cry out, it's time to act. Prayer must lead to obedience. Speak unto the children of Israel. God tells Moses to instruct the people with authority, showing that leadership requires faith-filled direction in times of crisis. That they go forward, the Hebrew, nasa, means to pull up, set out, advance. Despite the Red Sea in front and Pharaoh behind, God commanded forward movement. Faith often requires walking toward what looks impossible. This verse teaches that faith is not passive. There's a time to cry out, and there's a time to step forward in obedience. Prayer must lead to action. Sometimes God won't move the obstacle until we begin walking toward it. The waters didn't part until Moses stretched his hand and the people advanced. Version 21. In our lives, go forward means trusting God enough to step into the unknown, taking the job, starting the ministry, forgiving the person, or obeying His word even when it feels risky. It challenges us. Are we still praying about things God has already told us to do? At some point, faith must move its feet. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 15 reminds us that faith cries out to God but also moves forward in obedience. God's command to Israel was simple. Stop standing still, start stepping forward. What looks like an impossibility is often the pathway to your deliverance. Exodus chapter 14 verse 16. But lift thou up thy rod, and stretch out thine hand over the sea, and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. Lift thou up thy rod. The rod, Hebrew mateh, was a symbol of God's authority and power, used previously in the plagues of Egypt. Exodus chapter 7 verses 9 to 12. By lifting it, Moses acted as God's representative. Stretch out thine hand, a physical act of faith. God chose to use Moses' obedience and action as the means through which His miraculous power would be displayed. Over the sea, and divide it, only God could part the sea, but He commanded Moses to act in faith first. The miracle followed the obedience. Children of Israel shall go on dry ground. A double miracle. Not only was the Red Sea divided, but the seabed was completely dry. God's deliverance was perfect and complete. Through the midst of the sea, God made a way not around the obstacle, but directly through it. This verse teaches that God often uses human obedience as the instrument of His divine power. Moses' rod was ordinary, but in God's hand it became extraordinary. We may feel small or inadequate, but God asks us to stretch out what's in our hand, our gifts, our resources, our faith, and He will perform the miracle. God doesn't always remove obstacles, sometimes He opens a path right through them. What looks like a dead end may actually be God's passageway to victory. For us, the dry ground is a picture of God's faithfulness. He not only delivers us but ensures the path is secure for us to walk in peace. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 16 shows that miracles follow obedience. When Moses stretched out his hand, God stretched out His power. The same God who parts seas still makes a way through impossible places. Your step of faith can become the stage for God's greatest deliverance. Exodus chapter 14 verse 17. And I, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them, and I will get me honor upon Pharaoh, and upon all his host, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. The phrase indicates God allowing Pharaoh and his army to persist in their stubborn rebellion. See Exodus chapter 9 verse 12. God did not create evil in them, but confirmed their choice, using it to fulfill His purpose. They shall follow them. In arrogance, the Egyptians would pursue Israel into the path God opened, thinking they could control what only God had made possible. I will get me honor. Hebrew, kabd, means to be heavy, weighty, glorified. God's glory would be revealed through Pharaoh's defeat. The world would see his supremacy over Egypt's power. Upon Pharaoh, his host, chariots, horsemen, Egypt's military strength represented the pinnacle of human power. God would show that no army or weapon could stand against him. This verse reminds us that even the rebellion of the wicked cannot thwart God's plan. What looks like Pharaoh's decision to chase Israel was actually part of God's design to reveal His glory. Sometimes God allows our enemies to come closer not to destroy us, but to display His power when He defeats them. The Red Sea was not only Israel's deliverance, it was Egypt's downfall. This challenges us to trust God's sovereignty. When evil seems strong, God is still in control, using even the enemy's schemes to bring glory to His name. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 17 reveals that God gains glory even through the stubbornness of His enemies. Pharaoh's pursuit was not the end of Israel, it was the setup for God's triumph. When opposition rises, it may be the very stage where God shows His greatest power. Exodus chapter 14 verse 18. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. This verse reveals God's purpose behind Israel's impossible situation at the Red Sea. The Egyptians thought they could overpower God's people again, but God was orchestrating a moment to reveal His glory. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, means that God's actions were not only to save Israel but also to prove His sovereignty to their enemies. Pharaoh had repeatedly hardened his heart, refusing to acknowledge God's authority. Now, through the destruction of Pharaoh's army, God would make it undeniable that He alone is Lord over all creation. When I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh, points to divine vindication. Pharaoh's pride would become the very stage for God's power. What was meant to destroy Israel would instead display the greatness of God. This verse teaches that every trial, no matter how terrifying, can become a platform for God's glory and justice to shine. Sometimes God allows us to walk through situations that seem unfair or impossible, not because He's absent, but because He's setting the stage for His honor to be revealed. The battles you face may not be about you losing, they may be about God showing who He is through your victory. When your enemies think they have you cornered, God is often preparing to turn their pursuit into their downfall. Like Israel, you might stand before a Red Sea moment where faith is your only option, but it's there that God's power is most visible. God's deliverance isn't just about bringing you out, it's about revealing His glory to the world. What the enemy meant for evil becomes God's opportunity for honor. Stand firm, because your breakthrough will not only free you, it will make others know that He is the Lord. Exodus chapter 14 verse 19. And the angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them, and the pillar of the cloud went from before their face, and stood behind them. The angel of God. This is often understood as a manifestation of God's presence, sometimes called the angel of the Lord. He represents God Himself leading and protecting His people. See Exodus chapter 23 verses 20 to 21. Which went before the camp of Israel. Up to this point, God's presence in the cloud and fire was guiding them from the front. Exodus chapter 13 verses 21 to 22. Removed and went behind them. At this critical moment, God shifted position to stand between Israel and the Egyptian army. His role moved from guiding to guarding. The pillar of the cloud, a visible symbol of God's presence. By day it appeared as cloud, by night, as fire. Exodus chapter 13 verse 21. Now, it acted as a divine shield of protection. Stood behind them, God literally positioned Himself between His people and their enemies, showing He was their defender. God not only goes before us to lead, but also stands behind us to protect. He covers both our future and our past. This verse reassures us that when the enemy pursues, God places Himself as a barrier between us and danger. We may see the enemy, but the enemy cannot reach us without going through God first. Sometimes, God changes His position in our lives, not because He has left us, but because He knows exactly what we need. At times, we need guidance. At other times, we need protection. This challenges us to trust God's movements, even when He works in unexpected ways. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 19 declares that God is both our guide and our guard. He leads us when we need direction and shields us when enemies rise against us. The presence of God doesn't just show the way, it stands in the way of the enemy. Exodus chapter 14 verse 20. And it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and it was a cloud and darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these, so that the one came not near the other all the night. It came between. The pillar of cloud physically and spiritually stood as a divider, creating a barrier between Egypt and Israel. Cloud and darkness to them, to the Egyptians, God's presence was a source of confusion and obstruction. They could not see or advance. Light by night to these, to Israel, the same presence brought illumination, comfort, and guidance. The pillar functioned differently depending on which side people stood, so that the one came not near the other all the night. God created a supernatural separation. Egypt could not reach Israel until God was ready to act. God's presence has a dual effect. For believers it brings light, but for the rebellious it brings darkness. The same word that saves one person can harden another. This verse reminds us that God knows how to protect His people, even in the darkest night. While Israel rested in light, Egypt was paralyzed in darkness. In life, the same circumstances that confuse the unbeliever can become clarity and direction for the believer, because of God's Spirit in us. We must trust God's timing. Israel had to wait all the night, but during that time God was holding the enemy at a distance. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 20 reveals that God's presence separates his people from their enemies. To the world, his presence may seem like darkness, but to his children, it is light. God knows how to protect, preserve, and prepare his people while holding the enemy back. Exodus chapter 14 verse 21. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, an act of obedience. The rod in his hand symbolized God's authority. Moses acted, but the miracle came from God. The Lord caused the sea to go back. The power was entirely God's. What was humanly impossible, God accomplished by his might. By a strong east wind all that night, the miracle was dramatic but not chaotic. God used creation itself to accomplish his will. The east wind, ruach, symbolizes both God's spirit and his judgment. Made the sea dry land, not muddy, but completely dry. God's deliverance is perfect and leaves no trace of bondage. The waters were divided, a supernatural act showing God's sovereignty over creation. The very barrier that threatened them became the pathway to salvation. This verse reminds us that miracles require both obedience and God's power. Moses stretched his hand in faith, and God did what man could never do. Sometimes God's deliverance comes in stages. Notice it happened, all that night. Faith means trusting his work even when we can't see the full result immediately. The same sea that looked like a dead end became a doorway. In life, what seems like your biggest obstacle may become the very instrument of God's deliverance. This encourages us to act in faith with what God has placed in our hand. He will supply the miracle. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 21 shows that obedience plus God's power equals deliverance. The sea stood in their way, but God turned it into a pathway. When we stretch out in faith, God stretches out his power. Exodus chapter 14 verse 22. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand, and on their left. The children of Israel went into the midst of the sea. What was impossible became possible. By faith, they stepped where no path had ever existed before. Upon the dry ground, again, God's deliverance was perfect. The seabed wasn't muddy or unstable. God prepared a safe passage. The waters were a wall unto them. In Hebrew, choma means a fortified wall. God held back the sea like massive protective barriers, showing his power over creation. On their right hand, and on their left, this emphasizes total security. God's power surrounded them as they walked forward. True faith means stepping out into what looks impossible, trusting God's power to sustain you. Israel had to walk into the sea before they could reach the other side. God's deliverance is not half done. He didn't just push back the waters, he made the ground dry and the path secure. When God saves, he saves completely. The walls of water symbolize both protection for God's people and judgment waiting for their enemies. The same power that delivered Israel would soon destroy Egypt. For us, this is a picture of salvation. Through Christ, God makes a way where there was none, and we walk safely through what once threatened to drown us. Final takeaway. Exodus chapter 14 verse 22 shows that God doesn't just make a way, he makes a safe way. Israel walked through the impossible, surrounded by God's power. What once threatened to destroy them became the pathway to their destiny. Family, the God who parted the sea for Israel is the same God who makes a way for you today. What once threatened to destroy you can become the very path that leads you to victory. So keep trusting, keep walking, and keep standing in faith, because the walls that surround you are not for your destruction, but for your protection. Until next time, remember, with God, there is always a way through. If this word encouraged you, don't just keep it to yourself, share it. Hit that like button, subscribe for more teachings, and drop a comment below. God makes a way. Let's declare it together.